From the Chesapeake Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental reporting, this is Chesapeake Uncharted, the podcast that uncovers stories about the bay, its interconnected ecosystem, and the people who rely on them. I'm Jeremy Cox. On today's episode,
the changes in climate are going to make restoring the Chesapeake Bay all the harder, but what's the alternative? The only option is to improve the Chesapeake Bay and restore the Chesapeake Bay. Any other option is unacceptable.
When you've been working with state lawmakers from 3 states, of both parties, for 33 years, you don't tend to mince words. Ann Swanson is the executive director of the Chesapeake Bay Commission, a tri-state legislative commission where much of the action to clean up the bay is born. It's the venue where environmentally minded lawmakers from Maryland, Pennsylvania, and Virginia convene to collectively solve the bay's problems. During its 40-year history, the commission has overcome partisan and parochial differences to move the restoration forward in significant ways. The most significant of which was the launch of the state and federal restoration itself in 1983. Known as the Chesapeake Bay Program, the effort has survived 7 presidencies and several threats to zero out its federal funding. Each year, the 6 watershed states and the District of Columbia combine with the federal government to spend $1 billion or more cleaning up the bay and its drainage basin. But now, this unprecedented project to revive America's largest estuary is at a crossroads. A crossroads driven partly by climate change.
Changes in climate are affecting everything. So they're affecting water, they're affecting living resources, they're affecting the trees, the invasive species, everything we work on.
At its meeting in November 2021 in Irvington, Virginia, the Commission devoted much of its time to climate change. Not so much the causes, like cutting carbon emissions. The states are already making progress on that front, Swanson said. What's lacking are policies that help society grapple with the tangible consequences of climate change. Flooding caused by rising seas, worsening storms, pests expanding their ranges into new territories. You name it. These problems won't just make life more difficult in the Bay region. Scientists with the Bay Program warn that climate change will make it even harder to restore the Bay, effectively moving the goalposts farther away. And not to sound like a broken record here, it's already happening. If you think this is another climate doom and gloom story, don't hit that stop button just yet. It turns out that there's a remarkable relationship between fixing the climate and restoring the Chesapeake Bay. The solutions to both problems largely overlap, Swanson told me. For public policy, then, it's mostly about setting priorities instead of reinventing the wheel.
What we're trying to do is focus on water quality related issues and habitat related issues, but also focus on climate. So there are, for example, 27 agricultural practices that have been identified by USDA because they also contribute to carbon sequestration.
And that's only the beginning.
So if we can favor those practices, then we get essentially 2 for the price of 1. The same is true with habitat, favoring wetlands, favoring forest buffers, favoring contiguous forests. They're all good for water quality, and they're all good for climate. So that's what we're trying to do more and more, and re-examine our policies to make sure our policies are favoring both.
During this season of Chesapeake Uncharted, we're examining climate change. It's happening in the here and now, and not just at the North Pole and Antarctica. We're talking right here in the Chesapeake Bay region. With each episode, we're taking a close look at one slice of this new reality. Think of this as a snapshot in time before things get worse, when we as a society can maybe still change the future. So far this season, we've addressed the bay restoration only peripherally. Today, we examine the effort head-on through the lens of climate change. If we are to solve the bay's pollution woes, we must combat the climate crisis. To paraphrase the Harry Potter series, neither can live while the other survives. We'll talk about that right after this quick break.
Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you in part by Greenfin Studio, offering marketing and communications services for a greener world. Their team combines strategy, creativity, and scientific insight, setting them apart when conservation, sustainability, and scientific organizations need help telling their stories. See what they can do for you at greenfinstudio.com.
Welcome back. Today, we're looking at how climate change is making it tougher to save the Chesapeake Bay. I want to talk about how we can tackle both problems at the same time. But to understand how that works, you first need to understand how we ended up with a polluted bay. At the Chesapeake Bay Journal, covering the bay restoration is our bread and butter. Each monthly issue is jammed with stories about the latest progress reports, scientific findings, political maneuverings, local impacts, regulatory shifts, the whole swirling reality of this monumental effort. So what hope do I have of explaining it in a 30-minute podcast? And it would be even crazier to try to do it in 2 minutes, right? That sounds like a challenge. Hey Siri, set a timer for 2 minutes.
2 minutes, starting now.
Okay, here we go. The Chesapeake Bay is 200 miles long but only 4 to 30 miles wide, and it's remarkably shallow, with an average depth of just 21 feet. Yet it drains a huge amount of land, ranging from upstate New York to Virginia Beach to the West Virginia mountains. Compared to the world's average coastal bay, the Chesapeake drains about 10 times as much land for the volume of water it contains, and, when put head-to-head with the Gulf of Mexico, about 1,000 times as much. It also means that pollutants from that enormous watershed end up concentrated in our shallow bay, so our starring estuary is uniquely vulnerable to degradation. Any imbalance is going to have an extra large effect on it, and that's exactly what happened. With few or no controls on pollution from the 1600s through much of the 1900s, people treated the bay like a dumping ground. An embarrassment of nutrients flowed in from sewage pipes and ran off over-fertilized farms. Sediment smothered fish habitat, toxic chemicals showed up in the water. Trees and wetlands were cleared to make way for buildings and crops, removing natural filters. By the 1970s, the bay's decline was too obvious to ignore. Once lush underwater meadows were nearly gone. Squelched by overharvesting and disease, the oyster population plummeted to 1% of its peak size, from barely a century earlier. Each summer, an area of oxygen-starved water, called a dead zone, plagued the depths of the bay. Support coalesced around a Save the Bay movement. In 1983, President Ronald Reagan signed the first agreement between the states and the Environmental Protection Agency, pledging to restore it. It didn't promise much, but each ensuing agreement brought more rigor and more complexity to the effort. Then came 2010. In the face of lagging progress, the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency put the bay on a pollution diet, setting limits on the amount of nutrients and sediment that can enter the bay. The states face a 2025 deadline to take actions necessary to meet those pollution reductions. Whew. Get all that? The scientific consensus on the bay restoration effort is that it has yielded modest gains in water quality for the bay and many of its surrounding tributaries. Most of the improvements so far has come from two sources: cleaning up discharges at wastewater plants and reducing air pollution at power plants, which has led to less nitrogen raining back down on the watershed. The real heavy lifting, experts say, lies ahead, stepping up pollution reductions on the stormwater and groundwater flowing off the region's farms. For the bay's pollution diet to succeed, about 80% of future cuts will need to come from agriculture, according to the Bay program. And oh, by the way, climate change.
So of the studies you reviewed looking at the impact of climate change on nutrient and sediment cycling and yield, most of them indicated increases in nitrogen, phosphorus, and sediment.
This is Zach Easton, a Virginia Tech researcher and member of the Bay program's Scientific and Technical Advisory Committee.
There were differences with timing of when those changes might occur. So, a lot of studies indicate increased particularly nutrient yields in the winter and spring, because that's when we're expecting to see, the wetter conditions persisting. There were studies that indicated across the board increases in nutrient and sediment delivery or yield in the Chesapeake Bay system.
Easton is part of a team of researchers tasked by the Bay program to compile information from prior studies about how climate change will affect the restoration, namely the impact to so-called BMPs.
So, BMP is an acronym we use quite a lot.
Jeremy Hansen of the Chesapeake Research Consortium and the lead author of this study.
It stands for best management practice, and it can mean any action you're doing to improve environmental quality or any number of outcomes. When we use the term BMP in and around the Chesapeake Bay program, we tend to mean more specifically any practice or technology or action that you're putting on the ground, that you're doing out in the watershed to reduce the amount of nitrogen, phosphorus, or sediment flowing into your local stream or into the bay. So that means a wide range of different things, anything from cover crops planted by farmers to help retain sediment in the soil on site, or like stormwater retention ponds, or even your manure storage shed.
As the climate changes, bringing heavier downpours, warmer temperatures, and higher seas, there are a lot of unknowns around whether these tried and true practices will continue doing their jobs properly. Easton again.
There's a lot of conflicting evidence, and I think that's probably what the synthesis will ultimately show. I think we're relatively certain about some things, but there's a lot of question marks that remain out there.
Local, state, and federal agencies are spending millions of dollars today on these best management practices. I had to ask,
could this mean that things that we have done in recent history and up to the present not be sufficient given, like you said, the additional input from climate change?
Well, yeah, and again, the Bay program is largely recognizes that additional reductions are necessary due to climate change.
Easton and Hansen say they plan to publish the study to the Bay program's website by the end of 2021. Not all BMPs are the same, Easton said. Some are built once to a certain pollution capturing standard. Not all at once, but slowly over time, you might expect them to break down. Other practices, however, are undertaken year after year. It will be easier to adapt those to changing conditions.
Particularly for management type BMPs, right? So like nutrient management, things like that, those operate sort of on an annual basis. So there's an opportunity to either update the recommendations or update the BMP design and guidance to incorporate climate change. BMP is like a animal waste management system, right? So a big manure storage lagoon are harder to update once they've been installed, right? So there needs to be more thought put on the front end into the design, right? Do we need to update the intensity, frequency, duration curves to account for more intense storms before we even design the system?
So your recommendations could be that specific, like what's your square footage of your manure storage shed?
Right. Does it account for a 64% increase in intensity, things like that?
What does climate change mean for the Bay region? Here are some projections. A 1.3 to 5.2 foot rise in sea level by 2100, the fastest anywhere in the United States outside of Louisiana. An increase in average temperatures of 4.5 to 10 degrees by the 2080s, and lots more rainfall, with average annual totals already increasing at a rate of 2.6 inches per decade. Our next story highlights another climate metric, one that is already upending the Bay's ecosystem. A new study by the Virginia Institute of Marine Science finds that summer water temperatures in the Bay are increasing by nearly a half degree per decade, nearly double the speed of global ocean water temperatures. And it's happening even faster in the southern end of the Bay. The authors suspect that's a result of those waters mixing with warm water on the ocean shelf. This is disastrous news for a type of water-dwelling plant whose survival is nothing short of critical to the health of the Bay. Here's what one of my colleagues at the Bay Journal has to say about it.
Eelgrass is an important species because, first of all, underwater grasses in general are incredibly important. They provide habitat for lots of species, almost everything in the water spends part of its life cycle in underwater grass beds.
Carl Blankenship founded the Bay Journal 30 years ago and currently serves as our editor-at-large. He knows the bay inside and out.
They help remove sediments from the water. They stabilize the sediment so it doesn't get stirred up. They help buffer shorelines against erosion.
Another type of grass called widgeon grass also can tolerate saltier waters, but it can't inhabit all the places that eelgrass can. Eelgrass is a jack of all trades, Blankenship said. It does it all. Sequesters carbon, pumps oxygen into the water, slows erosion, helps keep the water clear, and absorbs nutrient pollution.
In the Chesapeake Bay, we have multiple freshwater species, but in the Chesapeake Bay, eelgrass is the only species that really thrives in high salinity waters. And so if you don't have eelgrass, there's many parts of Chesapeake Bay that has no obvious replacement species, so you lose all those functions.
If you're still not a fan of eelgrass, Blankenship has one more selling point.
When they talk about underwater grasses being important for things like juvenile blue crabs, they're really talking about eelgrass, because blue crabs spend their early part of their life cycle out in the ocean, and then they come back in as small juveniles into the bay. And it's really the eelgrass beds down by the mouth of the bay that they encounter when they return to the Chesapeake. And so there's a really tight link between eelgrass and blue crabs.
Do I have your attention now? As eelgrass goes, so goes the blue crab. I know I promised earlier that this wasn't a doom and gloom story, but, well, a little is unavoidable. The bay's eelgrass meadows are dying off, and climate change is a big part of the problem.
What's been the trajectory of eelgrass then over the last few, decades?
It's really been downward, both in the long term and the short term. Long term being like in the history of the bay, and the short term being the last few decades.
As recently as the 1960s, eelgrass could be found growing as far north as the Chesapeake Bay Bridge in Maryland.
And then it got knocked back with Tropical Storm Agnes in 1972, as did other grasses.
For the rest of the 70s and 80s, eelgrass started to rebound. At one point, it accounted for half of all the underwater grass in the bay's system. But around 1993, Blankenship said, it started declining again. This time, researchers pinned the problem on deteriorating water quality.
Because it's pumping that oxygen into the sediment, it needs lots of clear water, it needs lots of energy. And when the water is murky, it requires even more energy because it's not working as efficiently.
Climate change entered the picture in 2005 when a massive die-off followed an unusually hot summer.
Eelgrass likes cool water. It's near the southern edge of its range in the Chesapeake Bay. And it, as I've been saying, it needs sunlight. And when the water is murky, it has to work harder. When it's hot, it has to work harder still. So the combination of poor sunlight and high temperatures just basically overstresses the plant beyond its ability to actually pump oxygen into the sediment, and ultimately it dies.
The heat-related die-off started coming in waves in 2010, 2018, and 2019. The hits just keep coming, contributing to the growing sense among researchers that the bay's eelgrass is in deep trouble.
It may not totally disappear for many decades, and maybe there will be some pockets that hang around for a long, long time. But the problem is, because there's not a really good replacement for it, all the habitat, all the services it provides could largely be lost. It could be kind of like oysters. You still have oysters in the bay, but their population is so reduced, they're not providing anywhere near the same habitat, the water filtering, all the functions that the big oyster population used to do.
The Bay program has set a bay-wide target of sustaining 185,000 acres of all underwater grasses, an area the size of New York City. From a low of 38,000 acres in 1984, the partnership managed to bring that number up to nearly 100,000 acres by 2018. But the sharp declines in eelgrass in recent years have driven that total down to 62,000 acres, or just 1/3 of the restoration goal. The best thing that we can do for eelgrass at this point, Blankenship told me, is to stay the course on the bay-wide restoration, give the plants the clear water they need, and see if they come back. But as he's explaining this to me, I can just hear the optimism drain from his voice.
Clearing the water is proven to be a pretty difficult task too, and so it's a really difficult thing to work your way out of.
The good news. Fighting climate change has moved front and center in the bay restoration effort. In the 2014 watershed agreement, the federal agencies and states behind the cleanup committed to increasing the region's climate resiliency. They took another crucial step forward this past October. I was there for it.
We're going to go ahead and get started, but welcome to everyone. Welcome to the Brock Environmental Center, and what a beautiful day this is in 757. It is good.
A meeting of the Chesapeake Executive Council in Virginia Beach. This is the body responsible for giving the official stamp to bay restoration policies. The state governors, the D.C. mayor, the Chesapeake Bay Commission's leader, and the head of the EPA, they all have seats on the board. Virginia's outgoing governor, Ralph Northam, opens the meeting. On the docket this year, climate change.
Without aggressive action to combat climate change, our goal of a healthy bay is under threat. With rising temperatures and seas and more rain that is more intense, we risk increased pollution, the loss of natural protective habitats like wetlands and buffers, and threats to public health and safety.
For years, environmentalists have criticized the Council for either ignoring climate change or dealing with it only in platitudes. The 2014 Watershed Agreement was the first to mention climate action, but it only listed two goals: monitoring climate trends and conducting projects to enhance the resiliency of aquatic ecosystems. When they signed the new climate directive at this year's meeting, the Council was finally taking another swing at the issue. With the Lynnhaven River as a backdrop, Northam ticked off what the new directive has in store.
We will use the best climate science to chart our path forward. Our work will identify socioeconomic inequities and build equity into our bay protection efforts. We will protect our green infrastructure, such as wetlands and buffers, and prioritize cost-effective nature-based solutions for building resilience to climate change.
If the 2014 agreement was a line drawing on climate action, this new directive shades in some of the details. If I may take a stab at a plain English version of Northam's speech, what this directive does is say to the Bay Program staff, you're going to involve climate change in everything you do, and you should prioritize restoration actions that also protect communities from climate threats or trapped greenhouse gases. Some environmental groups were critical of the directive. The Chesapeake Bay Foundation was among them, calling it, quote, small steps when bold action is needed. But others, such as Kristen Riley, director of the Choose Clean Water Coalition, applauded the progress.
The key thing here, and it's similar with other things that are going on in the Bay program, you want things to be integrated into all different aspects of the Bay program, because that's really how you're going to get things done. You want to see things actually being integrated versus some sort of blanket statement that says climate change is bad and it's going to impact the restoration effort.
But there's still room for improvement, she added.
I think what is yet to be seen is how that actually translates into implementation and action, which is something that isn't in the directive.
All the Bay states and partners signed the climate directive, except for West Virginia. To find out why, I reached out to Terry Fletcher, spokesman for the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection, and he didn't respond. The state's governor, Jim Justice, can still sign it up until December 1st, officials say. Of all the governors in the region, the only two who showed up in person at the council meeting were Northam and Maryland's Larry Hogan. They took questions at the end. My hand shot up. Jeremy Cox with the Chesapeake Bay Journal. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
So as was mentioned earlier, we have 4 years left to meet the 2014 Bay Watershed Agreement commitments. And an internal review earlier this year said that at least 6 key commitments were unlikely to be achieved by that time, including a central one related to nutrients and sediment pollution. So what is the game plan to close those gaps? Is there urgency to do so? And if it's out of reach, when are you going to tell the public? That's the big question these days. 2025 is not very far off. There's still so much left to be done, not to mention the fact that climate change is bearing down. Northam, not hesitating, delivered a response on behalf of the council. I've edited it here for length.
Yeah, Jeremy, thank you for the question. And the first thing I would say is nothing is out of reach, especially when everybody realizes it as a challenge and also works together. So, and having grown up on a farm, I'm aware that agriculture, which is, by the way, our #1 industry in Virginia, has stepped up and will continue to need to step up. We also need to work with developers. We need to make sure that we have impervious grounding, for example, that we have less runoff that's going into the estuaries. You know, even things, Jeremy, like picking up behind our animals. You add all these things up collectively, we know that we're putting too many pollutants into the Chesapeake Bay. And so while our deadline is in 2025, we have a lot of work to do. Obviously, climate change is a challenge on top of that, but you know, that's why we're here today.
So farmers, developers, and yes, even dog owners have a role to play in cleaning up the bay. That doesn't make for much of a headline, but realistically, by 2025, Northam and Hogan will have been long out of office. How can they speak for what the next set of governors will do about the bay, or whether climate change will be a priority for them? Northam's successor, Republican Glenn Youngkin, was asked on the campaign trail, for example, whether he thinks humans are responsible for climate change. He replied that he doesn't know what's causing it, but agreed that the changing climate will be a challenge. At the risk of having to rename this the politics episode, we'll return to the Bay Commission and our conversation with Ann Swanson right after this last break.
Hi, this is Laura Lutz, editor at the Chesapeake Bay Journal. I hope you're enjoying our podcast, and I'd like to invite you to join the community of Bay Journal readers. If you care about climate change, wildlife, clean air, healthy communities, and of course the Bay and its rivers, you'll find news you can use at the Bay Journal, along with some great ideas for outdoor travel. Our subscriptions are free. Check us out at bayjournal.com and click on subscribe to start receiving the best independent environmental news in the Bay region.
Welcome back. On today's Chesapeake Uncharted, we're discussing bringing the Chesapeake Bay back to life, if climate change doesn't snuff it out first. You'll recall that Ann Swanson was telling us that these two priorities, restoring the bay and fighting climate change, don't have to be mutually exclusive. In fact, one can be accomplished at the same time as the other. The Chesapeake Bay Commission, which Swanson oversees, is composed of 21 members, Democrats and Republicans, urban and rural. At their most recent meeting, they're in this conference room at a hotel where one wall is basically one long window looking out on a cove that flows into the Rappahannock River. After laying out the issues that they face from climate change, Swanson delivers a set of recommended actions every state can take, based on a review of policy gaps conducted by her staff. She suggests establishing a state-level chief resilience officer. Virginia has one, but Maryland and Pennsylvania don't. The states could create or strengthen existing climate-focused advisory commissions. They should develop climate action plans and set up a dedicated source of funding. Then Swanson gives the group its marching orders.
We're going to break into delegations. We haven't actually done this before, but we thought in this situation, it was so important to get down to individual state level and see what you can do.
Off go these senators and delegates into an adjoining room, and they begin debating with their fellow state officials the merits of these proposals. The atmosphere is collegial, which is to say, nothing like on Capitol Hill. Afterward, I asked Gene Yaw about the experience. He's a Pennsylvania state senator and former chairman of the commission.
One of the things that was surprising that I think we pretty much agreed it would be a good idea for Pennsylvania to have somebody kind of in charge that has the ability to deal with various entities and bring everybody together. I mean, at times, and this is natural with any government, that it's very isolated in different departments, and we hear it, frequently that one part of government doesn't know what the other part is doing.
So stay tuned, Pennsylvania. A new law and a new resilience officer may be coming your way. For Swanson, therein lies the rub: laws. Executive orders are nice, but they can be changed with the flick of a pen.
Whatever actions have been taken have not been taken legislatively, which means it can whipsaw with each new administration. And that's where the Bay Commission comes in, because it's a legislative commission. Once you have a law on the books, you have longevity.
In this way, Swanson says, it's possible to break through the political noise to enact meaningful climate change actions, with the side effect being that you rehabilitate the Bay in the process. As she says,
any other option is unacceptable.
Thanks to Greenfin Studio, which combines creativity and communication savvy with scientific insight. Visit greenfinstudio.com to see how they can help your organization engage a wider audience. Chesapeake Uncharted is brought to you by the Bay Journal, your source for independent environmental news in the Chesapeake region. Production for this episode was by me, Jeremy Cox. The story was edited by Laura Lutz. Our marketing and advertising director is Jackie Kane. You can find more episodes of Chesapeake Uncharted on your favorite streaming service or at ChesapeakeUncharted.com. If you like what you're hearing, sign up for a free Bay Journal news subscription at bayjournal.com. Until next time, this has been Jeremy Cox. Take care.